if I can give a quick disclaimer on my part, I'm a strident environmentalist, but I think you make a persuasive argument that the current iteration of sustainability is itself victim to that same arrogance. So, can you take us then from the 30s to today?
I can. The two co-founders of the Trilateral Commission were David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski. It was kind of the beauty and the beast, in a sense. Rockefeller had the money, Brzezinski had the brains. And then the next question is, why did they pair up? What brought an odd couple together? It just so happened that a couple years earlier, from 1973, that Brzezinski had written a book called Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technotronic Era. And the fact that he wrote Between Two Ages indicates that there's three ages. There's age one, the original, there's one in the middle, and then there's a future age coming. So America's role in the Technotronic Era talked about that middle ground, that middle time period that was leading to a future time period that Brzezinski called the Technotronic Era. And just so happens that at the time he wrote the book, he was a professor in political science at Columbia University. That doesn't prove anything by itself, just me saying that. But the way things work in academia, ideas never die. You know, people keep talking, and there's the lunchroom, and there's parties, and there's conferences, whatever. You know, I am certain he was completely aware of what the original technocracy movement was and proposed. But his Technotronic Era was basically a knockoff of the original technocracy thought, where technology was going to control society. And the old-fashioned, as they called it, the old-fashioned institutions of the nation state and so on were gone. In other words, they were outmoded, and there was going to be this new technology-based era that would be driven by the corporations, the giant corporations of the world. So when the Trilateral Commission first formed, Rockefeller, I'm convinced in my mind anyway, Rockefeller had a thought that technocracy could be used for a resource grab. In other words, he could accumulate resources away, take them away from the people of the world and nation states of the world, and accumulate resources into their own control so that they could provide goods and services to the whole social system. This is what technocracy originally proposed. But back in those days, Anthony Sutton and myself recognized that what they called the new international economic order was all over their literature. We knew that there was something going on, but we didn't understand technocracy. I had no view of it at that point. So we thought, well, maybe they just kind of mean they're going to rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic and they're going to game the system for themselves. We'd seen that happen many times. So we analyzed and wrote about the Trilateral Commission and their new international economic order, thinking, okay, we see what they're trying to do. They're trying to dominate resources in the world. That was clear even back then. They wanted this new international economic. We just didn't know what new meant. Now I know that the word new referred and pointed back to technocracy, sustainable development, if you will. They in one sense, they hijacked the whole concept of original technocracy. And they used it for other purposes, other than what the original technocrats wanted to do. The environmentalists were in the same boat, by the way, in the early 70s, and all the way up probably from the early 70s up through about 1992, when the Rio de Janeiro conference convened and produced Agenda 21. The original environmentalists, and there's some of them still around, gray hair, ponytails, whatever, they're still out there. They got slid out of the movement, and it was taken over by and large by the big foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Foundation, all these big giant money pits. They moved all the original Greens out, basically just kicked them out and said, we're taking over. And so even today, I've talked to many of these people that are part of my age group and said, well, what do you feel about this? They're madder than a wet hen.
You know, the Sierra The Sierra Club has a very similar issue, and in my opinion, I think most people involved with the Sierra Club are honorable people who truly do want to restrain the impact of technological society and population on the environment. And yet, especially in the last decade, but going back for decades, you do see a concerted effort to steer that legitimate sentiment in the direction of something that's perhaps, let's just say, has different agendas in mind.
Exactly. So anyway, that the new international economic order was what the Trilateral Commission first came up with, and I lay modern globalization at their feet. There was globalization movements before that. Yes, there was. All the same organizations that we point back to, the League of Nations and the Atlantic Institute, and a whole bunch of organizations you can look back to and say, well, they were promoting globalization. They were. But the Trilateral Commission kind of invented the modern movement that we have, that we're looking at today. And I think as we speak about this, you kind of understand why I say that. Oddly enough, the next year, 1974, the United Nations passed a general resolution. It was 3201. I never saw this till a few years ago, I swear. I was like, my eyeballs popped out. I said, could not believe it.
What were the contents?
It was, the resolution number was 3201. Here's the title: Declaration on the Establishment of a New International Economic Order. Same language used by the Trilateral Commission 6 months earlier. Not a mistake. The Rockefeller family had a very close connection to the United Nations. They always had. The family had actually given the land that the UN building was built on. So, and they gave money every year to them from their billions. And so it was easy to understand how the United Nations got seeded with this concept of a new international economic order. It wasn't until 1992 that the marketing name for this was changed to sustainable development. It just didn't, it wasn't a substantive change. It was just to make it more palatable, because anybody, in my experience back in the 70s, anybody that heard the phrase new international economic order immediately threw up a red flag and say, wait a minute.
Sure.
Yeah, we don't like the sound of that right off. We don't know anything about it, but we don't like it. So changing the name was a very astute thing for them to do. But Rockefeller seeded the United Nations with this concept to push this new resource-based economic system. And anybody that's looked at sustainable development understands that it's a resource-based economic system. It's not a political system. It's an economic system controlling resources. That's what the sustainable is all about, and that's what development is about. Development is not a political term, it's an economic term. So we have this thread where you have a private group of industrialists, of global elite movers and shakers, political, legal, media, multinational corporations, standing on one side, providing the money through foundations and through grants and starting organizations and stuff like that. And then you had the United Nations, which is kind of a people viewed as kind of a quasi-governmental organizations over here that has the clout to spread the contagion to other nations in the world. Now, Brzezinski and the Trilateral Commission and Rockefeller, they're all based in the United States at that point. They wanted this to be a global program. They didn't have the clout to do that themselves, but the United Nations did, because even back then, they had basically all the members of the nation states in the world were members of the United Nations.